This is the old hard drive which has failed. And this is the new one which I bought very cheaply, 60 gigabytes, all it needs. And it's an SSD, of course. The installer is on this USB here. And then we can just boot up. So as soon as the screen lights up, we just hit Alt. And then this gives us the boot selection. In the boot selection there's two devices here. The hard drive, which already has a system installed on there, it's detected that as Windows on the left, but it's not actually Windows and it can't be booted. But on the right we have the USB stick, which it detects as EFI boot. So we can select this and boot from it. We now have a few different options of install, command line install, expert install, and a few others. The important one here is not which one to use, install is good enough, but the boot options. We can edit these with E. After setting the correct boot options, we can just press F10 to boot. The screen will then stay the same for about a minute or so. And then we'll see the usual kernel messages before entering the installer. This is the minimal install, so I've hooked up an Ethernet cable in order to download the installer components. Most of these pages are pretty simple, just keyboard layout, and then it detects the network. So I'll just set a host name. And then we select the mirror for the installer components. Time zone and a few other things. And then we get to the partition stage. Right, now on this step, because the USB is still installed, it sees two disks, so we want to use manual. So we want to remove the existing partitions. And then create a new partition with most of the space. For the root system, and then the remaining space I'll use most for swap, and the remaining space is for the EFI partition. The automatic partitioning does a similar process but doesn't add the swap space, which is why I've done it manually. And it now will install the base system, and after this we can select other optional packages including all of the desktops. I can now select a software collection or multiple software collections. I'm going to install Ubuntu Mate Minimal and the OpenSSH server. These can be installed later, but it's better to install any desktop at this point. If you install them later, then they won't be configured quite as well and you may have to configure them manually. One of the first things I did was to install the MacBook fan control utility. This is an open source utility which allows custom fan speeds to be set based on CPU temperature. By default, the fans never spin up much, which causes overheating. This causes CPU performance to be reduced, which I don't want. This program also works on new MacBooks, which suffer from even worse overheating and CPU throttling. I found these settings to work quite well. The fan speed can be increased to 6000, but it's rather loud then. Even though there's no hardware acceleration, transparency is still working in the terminal, and windows move across the screen relatively well. You can see there is some delay, and the CPU usage does move up because all rendering is done in software. Despite the poor performance of the CPU, programs like Firefox do still open relatively quickly thanks to the SSD. It's possible to play videos and the audio does work. Although you can see in the corner here, the CPU usage is much too high. all of the work for playing the video has to be done by the CPU, and the GPU is effectively idle all the time. The speakers work okay, but for loud sounds I have noticed some popping. We can view some additional system info using this useful tool. So it's a Core 2 Duo. And we can see here graphics is using LLVM pipe, which is a software renderer, although the full resolution is working. This is of course a dual core, not very good performance. Only 2 GB of RAM. All of the network interfaces do work, although for the Wi-Fi to work, additional drivers have to be installed through the Software and Updates Additional Drivers page. It is possible to select the nvidia binary driver, but it is no better than the open source driver, neither work. In the Xorg log we can see the system is booted with no mode set, which is required, otherwise the system won't get as far as a login screen at all, although it can be connected over SSH. And we can see in here that fbdev is being used as the display driver. The open source driver simply hangs and crashes Xorg, and the proprietary NVIDIA driver fails and quits without powering the display at all. Although it is possible to use Virtual Console with the proprietary driver installed, but there's no reason to install it because it doesn't work, and you can simply get a working system with no mode set and the open source driver not being used at all. Quite good for a cheap eBay buy.